You've said it 1,000 times. I'll do it later. And in that moment, it felt completely rational. It felt like a decision made from a place of logic. You'd handle it when you had more energy, more clarity, more time. But later came, and you didn't do it. A new later was invented, and another one after that, until the task sat in the back of your mind like a low hum you couldn't silence, draining your attention even when you weren't actively thinking about it. This is not a willpower problem. This is your brain running a survival protocol that was never designed for the world you live in right now. Most people assume procrastination is about laziness or a lack of discipline. But that framing completely misses what's actually happening inside the brain. When you look at a task, whether it's starting a report, answering a difficult email, or beginning a long-term project, your brain doesn't evaluate it the way a machine would. It doesn't weigh the task based on logic alone. Instead, it runs the task through an emotional filter first. The limbic system, which processes emotions and detects threats, scans the task for discomfort. If the task is associated with boredom, confusion, self-doubt, or any form of psychological friction, the limbic system flags it as something to avoid. And this process happens before you are even consciously aware of it. Here's the part most people don't understand. The decision to procrastinate is not made in the rational, planning part of the brain. It's made in the emotional part. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for long-term planning, impulse control, and deliberate decision-making, gets overridden. Not because it's weak, but because the emotional signal is faster. The brain's threat detection system fires before its reasoning system fully engages. So when you say, "I'll do it later," you're not making a rational plan. You're responding to an emotional impulse that has disguised itself as a rational plan. There's a specific mechanism at work here called temporal discounting. This is a well-documented cognitive bias where the brain assigns less value to rewards that are far away in time and more value to rewards that are immediately available. This is why scrolling through social media feels more appealing than working on a project due in 2 weeks. The dopamine hit from scrolling is available right now. The satisfaction of completing the project is distant, abstract, and uncertain. Your brain, which evolved to prioritize immediate survival, naturally gravitates toward the present reward. It's not that you don't care about the future. It's that your brain literally perceives the future as less real than the present moment. This is also why the phrase "I'll do it later" feels so psychologically comfortable. It creates an illusion of productivity without requiring any actual effort. The brain registers the intention to act as a partial completion of the task. Making a vague plan to do something later activates a mild sense of relief, almost as if you've already started working on it. But you haven't. What you've actually done is temporarily offload the emotional discomfort while maintaining the belief that you're still in control. This is a form of emotional regulation, not task management. You're not planning. You're soothing yourself, and here is where the cycle becomes dangerous. Once the initial relief of postponing fades, a new emotion surfaces: guilt. You start feeling bad about not doing the thing you said you'd do. That guilt creates an additional layer of discomfort, which your brain now associates with the original task. So the next time you think about starting it, the emotional weight is heavier. The task itself hasn't changed at all, but your emotional relationship with it has shifted. The avoidance grows stronger because the psychological pain linked to the task has compounded. This is the procrastination guilt loop, and it is one of the most self-reinforcing behavioral patterns the brain can fall into. Each cycle makes the next one harder to escape. The environment you live in makes this loop significantly worse. Modern digital life is structured around instant gratification. Every app on your phone is engineered to deliver small dopamine hits with minimal effort. Social media, streaming platforms, short-form video content, they all exploit the brain's preference for immediate reward. When your brain is conditioned to receive frequent, effortless stimulation, Anything that requires sustained effort begins to feel disproportionately difficult. It's not that the task is objectively hard. It's that your baseline for stimulation has been artificially elevated. A normal, reasonable task now feels unbearable by comparison because the brain has recalibrated what easy means. Researchers describe this as existing in a dopamine-saturated environment. When the brain constantly receives low-effort rewards, its sensitivity to effort-based rewards decreases over time. The neural pathways that connect effort to satisfaction weaken. Even when you complete something meaningful, the emotional payoff feels muted. Your brain essentially stops reinforcing productive behavior because it has cheaper, easier sources of dopamine available at all times. This is why someone can scroll for 4 hours without fatigue but feel mentally exhausted after 20 minutes of focused work. The brain hasn't run out of energy. It has been trained to resist effort because effort no longer competes effectively with the effortless alternatives surrounding it. There's another layer that is often overlooked: decision fatigue. Every day, you make hundreds of small decisions. What to eat, what to wear, how to respond to messages, what to prioritize next, which notification to check. Each of these decisions, no matter how trivial they seem, draws from a limited pool of cognitive resources. By the time you sit down to work on something important, your prefrontal cortex may already be depleted. The executive function required to initiate a difficult task is weakened, which makes the emotional pull toward avoidance even stronger. You're not consciously choosing to procrastinate. Your brain is running on fumes and defaults to the lowest energy option available, which is doing nothing meaningful at all. This depletion is amplified by the constant context switching that defines modern life. Checking email, responding to notifications, toggling between browser tabs. Each switch forces the brain to recalibrate its focus. Research suggests it takes roughly 23 minutes for the brain to fully re-engage after a significant distraction. If you're switching contexts every few minutes, your brain never reaches deep cognitive engagement. It stays in a shallow processing mode where initiating effortful work feels nearly impossible. The mental fatigue you experience isn't from the work itself. It's from the constant low-level cognitive noise that fills the spaces between productive moments. Now, here is the reframing that changes everything. Procrastination is not a character flaw. It is a symptom of poor emotional regulation interacting with an overstimulating environment. The task you're avoiding is not necessarily difficult. What's difficult is the emotional experience your brain predicts you'll have while doing it. That prediction is the real barrier. The brain doesn't procrastinate on things that feel emotionally neutral or enjoyable. It procrastinates on things that trigger discomfort, whether that discomfort is boredom, fear of failure, perfectionism, or a vague sense of overwhelm. The avoidance is always about the anticipated emotion, never truly about the task itself. This means that addressing procrastination at the level of willpower or discipline will always fail eventually. You can force yourself to act through sheer effort for a while, but if the underlying emotional pattern isn't addressed, you'll fall back into the same cycle. It's like holding your breath underwater. You can sustain it briefly, but eventually, biology wins. The brain will always seek to minimize discomfort unless another mechanism is in place to redirect its response. So what actually works? The answer isn't motivation. It's not raw discipline either. It's reducing the emotional friction between you and the task. One of the most effective approaches is something psychologists call implementation intentions. Instead of telling yourself, "I'll work on it later," you create a specific if-then plan. When I sit down at my desk after lunch, I will open the document and write for 10 minutes. This works because it removes the decision-making step entirely. The brain no longer has to evaluate whether this is the right moment to start. It simply follows a preloaded instruction. The cognitive cost of initiation drops significantly, which means emotional resistance has far less power to intervene. Another mechanism that disrupts the procrastination loop is the Zeigarnik effect. This is the brain's well-documented tendency to fixate on incomplete tasks. Once you begin something, even for just 2 or 3 minutes, the brain starts processing it differently. It shifts from avoidance mode into completion mode. The task stops being a source of dread and becomes an open loop that the brain naturally wants to close. This is why the hardest part of almost any task is the very beginning. Once you cross the initiation threshold, the emotional resistance usually fades within minutes. The brain recalibrates and realizes the task isn't nearly as threatening as it originally predicted. There is also a deeper identity level shift that plays a critical role. If you repeatedly tell yourself, "I'll do it later," over time your brain begins encoding that behavioral pattern as part of who you are. You start seeing yourself as someone who delays, who can't follow through, who lacks the ability to act when it matters. Once that self-concept solidifies, it becomes self-reinforcing. You procrastinate not because the task is hard, but because procrastination is what someone like you does. Breaking this cycle requires more than behavior change. It requires updating the internal narrative, not through affirmations or forced positivity, but through consistent, small evidence that contradicts the old story. Every time you begin a task when your brain tells you to wait, you're not just completing an action. You're rewriting an identity pattern at the neurological level. This is why environment design is ultimately more powerful than motivation. If your workspace is filled with distractions, your phone within arm's reach, unnecessary tabs open, notifications buzzing, then your brain is constantly being pulled toward the path of least resistance. Removing those cues doesn't require willpower. It restructures the decision landscape so that the productive action becomes the default path. The brain doesn't have to fight competing stimuli because the stimuli have been removed from the equation. This is not about being restrictive or punishing yourself. It's about being strategic with the signals your environment sends to your brain throughout the day. One of the most underestimated tools in overcoming chronic procrastination is emotional clarity. Many people don't actually know why they're avoiding a task. They feel a vague internal resistance and simply react to it. But if you pause and ask yourself what you're actually feeling about the task, boredom, fear, confusion, inadequacy, you create a moment of metacognition. You step outside the emotional reaction and observe it from a slight distance. Research in effective neuroscience shows that labeling an emotion reduces its intensity. The amygdala's response literally softens when the prefrontal cortex identifies what it's reacting to. Understanding your resistance doesn't eliminate it completely, but it weakens it enough to allow action. There's one more thing worth understanding. The brain does not treat all future moments equally. When you say, "I'll do it later," you're imagining a version of your future self who is more rested, more motivated, and more capable. But that future self is, neurologically speaking, almost a stranger. Brain imaging studies have shown that when people think about their future selves, the neural activation patterns resemble those that occur when thinking about other people, not about themselves. In a very real sense, you're not postponing for your own benefit. You're handing the burden to someone your brain doesn't fully recognize as you. This is why later rarely becomes now. The person you were counting on doesn't exist the way your brain imagined. Understanding all of this changes how you approach the problem. Instead of trying to become more disciplined through brute force, you start designing systems that align with your brain's actual architecture. You shorten the gap between intention and action. You reduce the number of decisions needed to begin. You remove environmental triggers that pull attention away from effort-based activity. You label emotional resistance before it spirals into full avoidance. And you build small, repeated moments of follow-through that gradually reshape the identity your brain has constructed around delay. The phrase, "I'll do it later," is never really about time. It's about emotion. It's the brain choosing comfort over discomfort in a moment where the future feels too distant to matter. And in a world that floods you with effortless stimulation every waking second, that choice is becoming harder to resist. Not because you're weaker than you used to be, but because the environment is stronger than it has ever been. The solution is not to fight your brain. It's to understand it clearly enough that you stop falling for its shortcuts. Because the moment you see the pattern for what it truly is, it begins to lose its grip. Not all at once, but enough to shift something. Enough to start.